Today's worship service, we're exploring the topic of reproductive justice. You might think that's an interesting choice for Father's Day. And I think that's important, because I think when we hear reproductive justice, we often default that is a women's issue. Perhaps not the UU men that Ellen referred to, but so much in our society is like, that's a women's issue. But when you think about why is reproductive justice a women's issue, other than the fact it maybe impacts women the greatest? Because if nothing else we've learned in Unitarian Universalists, we are all collective. We want collective liberation, because something that hurts one of us hurts us all. And I think it's important to remember that. So I think reproductive justice is important for us to remember on Father's Day. And of course, as Chris mentioned at the opening of the service, we've got Juneteenth, we've got Bride Month as well. And so why reproductive justice? I think when you look at the historic discrimination in the healthcare system, particularly, not just, but certainly around reproductive justice, it has impacted historically marginalized communities such as the African American community disproportionately. The health outcomes for people of color and indigenous people in our culture, it's really significant. And then with Pride celebrating the LGBTQ community, it was, in some states it's still true, but it was not that long ago throughout the country, LGBTQ folk were not able to adopt children. So the discrimination impacts each of these communities, and reproductive justice is a broad term. It was a term that actually came from a women of colour collective called Sistersong. And they originated the term because they felt pro-choice was too limiting a term for reproductive justice. And here's a brief statement of what they said. They said, reproductive justice is a human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And reproductive justice has been a big topic for Unitarian Universalists. Because for 50 years, our congregation, almost 60 years, have been working, speaking, and witnessing to reproductive rights and justice. We were the first religious tradition to issue a statement in support of the dignity and respect for the decisions of women to make choices. And that was in 1961. We were a founding member of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice in 1973. And we were a vital player in the historic Supreme Court decision, Roe versus Wade. Some of you may know, but the origins of that case originated at First Unitarian Church of Dallas. And reproductive justice, I think it is important to think of it beyond just the issue of abortion. I know when I would go and speak, when I was a minister in Austin, I'd go and speak to the Texas legislature, the state legislature, because we were in Austin, the state capital. And I'd often go and take a packet of condoms with me when I spoke to legislators. Because I think when we start talking about reproductive justice and condoms, we're talking about preventing sexually transmitted disease. We're talking about preventing unwanted pregnancies. And it allows men to have a role in that. But then when I would talk to some of the state legislators and I'd put condoms in the table, they were acting like middle schoolers. And I'm being unfair to middle schoolers when I say that. You would have thought I had put a dead animal in front of them. The immaturity around. And just so you know, these were packaged condoms. They were not used. So I think it's really important that we, as men, take an equal role in supporting women and partner on these issues. And our approach as Unitarian Universalists is focused in 4 areas of reproductive justice, grounding our decisions on the lived experience of people rather than dogma or creed. Acknowledging that in the 20th century, births moved from homes into the medical establishment. That was a move that happened mainly in the 20th century. The healthcare system, as I mentioned earlier, does reflect a class, sexual, and racial inequity, and that needs to be acknowledged in any reproductive justice. And women challenged the medical system by taking control of their body, as we see with the rise of professional midwives and doulas. And sexuality is sacred. We have taken that on with our OWL program, where we recognize that sexuality is a huge, important, and spiritual part of all our identities. It's a sacred and powerful gift, and it's also an opportunity to harm, exploit, and discriminate. So let's celebrate today reproductive justice in all its complexity, diversity, and possibility. And let's acknowledge the reverence for life. Because there's complexity around the issue of abortion and reproductive justice, with different experiences and different beliefs around the same situation. But one thing we can agree on, there should not be shame. Shame creates feelings of fear, blame, and disconnection. We blame ourselves for what happened and fear that we will be rejected by others because of decisions we may have made. In 2015, our Unitarian Universalist Association issued a statement on reproductive justice as a statement of conscience, which is agreed on by all our congregations. And one of the statements from it is this. It says, "We recognize the religious political necessity for autonomous reproductive and sexual lives with open minds, helping hands, and loving hearts. We work towards reproductive justice and commit to placing insecurity with safety, fear, with acceptance. Replacing insecurity with fear, with safety, fear with acceptance, judgment with love, and shame with compassion." So later on in this service, we will be hearing our reproductive justice stories from within this congregation. And this is going with that first statement I said around our approach. We want to ground this in our lived experience and not dogma and creed. Because reproductive justice, I believe, is a responsibility of all of us. LGBTQ, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, children. It's a responsibility of all of us. And too often, the topic gets swept under the carpet and not discussed in an open, healthy, and honest way. And hopefully by doing this today, this will open up conversations for all of us to have with our families, with our friends, with our neighbors.
So of all those things we're celebrating today, I could offer a reflection on the Warriors' victory, which is fun. But Father's Day spoke to me today. So I had a lovely day yesterday with my non-baseball loving family because they took me to a baseball game. No sign of greater love than that. And I hope that many of you had similarly special time with loved ones. But at the same time, I want to recognize that Father's Day can be complicated for many people and downright awful for others, depending on their life story. And in some ways, Father's Day is complicated for me, too. My father was not much in my life when I was growing up. And one of the many things I have grown to admire more about my mother as I have grown older is this. She was intentional about surrounding me with a number of father figures while I was growing up. And they were very different people and had different perspectives, but there was one thing that she was adamant about with each of them, is that they were kind to a little tow-headed blonde boy. I want to tell you about one of those men. His name is Jeff Jones. He was about a decade older than me and was an important mentor and guide as I navigated high school graduation into college. He snuck me into a couple bars. He was quick-witted and funny. He encouraged me to keep a journal, and he introduced me to the band The Smiths, for which I am forever grateful. He loved to dance. He had this amazing over-the-top fashion sense. I will never forget a sort of vaudeville show he and other friends of my mom's put on one evening, where Jeff came out in this amazing flowing dress and proceeded to knock this Sammy Davis Jr. torch song completely out of the world. It was pure, pure joy. Being a gay man in mid-central Illinois in the 1980s was, I grew to learn, beyond difficult. Jeff was ostracized by his immediate family. He had to be careful who he was seen with and what he was doing. He continually had to cover his full identity. He contracted AIDS early in the pandemic, and he died. That was 30 years ago. I bring this up today on Father's Day because he was a hugely important father figure to me, as were several other gay men in my mom's life while I was growing up. And today, when I listen to the revolting diatribes from some politicians and others who have a high-profile megaphone about how children are being threatened by LGBTQI influencers with indoctrinating a lifestyle or pushing immorality, I border on rage. Jeff Jones was one of the kindest, most honest, creative, alive people I have ever met. He didn't groom me for anything. He helped guide, support, console, encourage, and show me how to be a man in this world. Small-minded, insecure people, mostly men and usually white men like me, are a continual threat to gay and trans people. A friend of mine, who was the political director at Planned Parenthood for years, had an illuminating term for people like this. She calls them the dominionists. Dominant people by race, gender, and sexual identity who believe arrogantly that their freedom should be the right to dominate the non-white women, gay, and trans. So what do we do? Well, one wonderful way is to lift up love. The stories of real people, individuals whose fact of living in full puts the lie to the dominionist bullying through stigma and shame. So this Father's Day, I lift up Jeff, I celebrate him, and all gay, lesbian, trans parents and parental figures in our world who face prejudice, isolation, and violence, and maintain the fortitude to hold grace and compassion for the children, including and especially the cis and straight children like me who look up to and learn so much from them.
We are now going to tell our reproductive justice stories from this community. These will be read by Chris, Jen, and myself anonymously. I invite you to really settle into the story and try and suspend whatever judgment around this and explore it with curiosity. And I want to acknowledge that some of these stories will be difficult to hear. They're very emotional, they're very personal, they're very vulnerable by those who shared them. So if anyone needs any support after the service, please seek me out or seek any of our worship leaders. And if those in the pastoral care team, if you could raise your hand, Beth and Sally, reach out to us because some of this is very, very emotional for all of us. But these are people's lived experience. These are, as the song that we just sang said, sharing stories from deep inside. These are deep personal stories. And I'll begin. I had 2 abortions while I was a teen. One was illegal, one was legal. Both were painful, shameful experiences. But the first could have killed me. I lay alone in agony for a week, cramping and bleeding, before my sister got me to medical care. I am surprised I was able to have children.
We were in love and would marry in another year, but children weren't in our plans. His 2 were enough for him, and I knew I wanted none. So after a discussion with my GP, admiring photos of his grandchildren but not changing my mind, he set up an abortion appointment for me. It was quick, not especially painful or expensive, and it truly was not regretted, even decades later. And I love my stepchildren.
As a starving student, Planned Parenthood was my chosen health provider. They had a sliding scale for payment based on income and provided a good number of services. So when my almost husband and I needed blood tests to obtain our marriage license, I made an appointment at Planned Parenthood for the tests. As we parked outside the clinic and left the car, a crowd of people rushed us, yelling at us and holding signs and waving a jar with what appeared to be a human fetus in my face. Quickly, clinic personnel appeared on the sidewalk, taking our arms and escorting us into the building. I was extremely confused and shaken, and I can only imagine how I would have felt had I been there for the purpose that ugly group of people presumed.
I was 27 years old, unmarried and living with an abusive boyfriend. I often had large bruises that I covered with makeup and made up stories of how I got injured. Many people were kind enough not to show that they didn't believe me. But I knew they knew. My friends would tell me to leave him, but I had a job that would not sustain me by myself. And I was codependent on this man. I was emotionally abused to the point where I thought I would never find anyone better. And my self-esteem was at the lowest it could possibly go. I was pulling away from my family so that they would not see the bruises and ask a lot of questions. I was so ashamed of who I had become and what I had tolerated, and I felt there was no way out. Then, even though I used birth control, I got pregnant. I knew in my heart that I could not have this man's baby and be tethered to him for the rest of my life. I could not afford a baby. I did not have the means emotionally to care for a baby, so my decision was to get an abortion. I used Planned Parenthood, and they were kind, understanding, and genuinely caring. I have never once doubted that decision. It was the right thing to do at the time. Doing this gave me the courage to come clean with my mother, who supported my choice 100%. She and my dad helped me move into my own place, and I was free to learn to love myself again. And I did.
I worked in healthcare, some of that in women's health, some of that community grassroots women's health for many years. I was fortunate to come of adulthood when women were gaining ground in society and learning about their right to own their own body. Later, working for a corporation that matched employee donations to charities, my Planned Parenthood match was denied. I challenged it, asking if there was a policy against supporting the whole array of women's health, especially for underserved, because one service was elective abortion, and someone in corporate was against that. They didn't budge, but I hope I was heard. I don't think I was flagged for that. I continue to contribute to this important organization.
My husband and I were happily married since we were both concerned with the ramifications of overpopulation. We had decided on having 2 children. Perfect. I found myself pregnant a 3rd time after I had given away all my maternity clothes and small baby paraphernalia. But after talking about it, we decided, what the heck? 3 isn't so bad. So we had our 3rd child. After the 3rd child's birth, I was fitted with an IUD, an intrauterine device, and got pregnant again. This was before the Roe v. Wade decision, but my gynecologist said there was no way to allow a pregnancy to continue with an IUD in place. So that fetus was aborted and the IUD removed. I went on the pill. Several years later, Roe v. Wade, now in effect, I got pregnant yet again. But there was no question in our minds by that point. We didn't want more children. I remember scheduling an abortion between having lunch with a friend and going grocery shopping. It was that simple and seemed that mundane. It was a medical procedure, something akin to getting my teeth cleaned. So much for suffering guilt or anguish. There was none.
At a very young age, in a time of instability, my husband and I made a difficult decision for me to have an abortion. Fortunately, it was legal and safe. I sometimes think about it, even if it was the right decision at the time. It was a personal, situational experience that very few in my life knew about.
I'm frustrated by the fact that abortion is a needed medical procedure so rarely brought up in the debates. We went through years of infertility and had friends in our support group that aborted non-viable fetuses so they could try for a pregnancy again rather than waiting for the miscarriage, which can also be dangerous for a woman.
People don't realize how difficult it can be to get an abortion right now. A mother at our daughter's elementary school was pregnant, had an ultrasound, and the mass of cells reproducing in her womb was not creating a fetus. But Sequoia Hospital is run by Dignity Health, a Catholic organization. She was told that there was nothing they could do. Abortion is not performed at that hospital, a county hospital.
A woman I know was trying to have a family, started bleeding late term, and when she went to the hospital, which was run by a Catholic organisation, she was told it was too far along in the pregnancy, there was nothing they could do. Her husband had to run around town trying to find another hospital that would take their insurance and admit her. She found the care she needed, but really, who needs to be put through that when they're experiencing the trauma of a loss of a pregnancy?
An older woman I knew told me about her experience when abortion was still illegal. She was married and had 2 small children and found herself unexpectedly pregnant. She was very sick with the pregnancy, and soon started bleeding. When she went to the doctor, he checked the blood and didn't find any fetal tissue. So he told her to go home and save what she was hemorrhaging so they could verify the fetus had been naturally aborted. She dutifully did this overnight, and when the doctor could verify fetal tissue, he gave her the care she required. Malpractice? He could have lost his license, his practice, his livelihood, and spent time in prison if anyone had questioned the legitimacy of the DNC she needed.
We drove from Texas for 25 hours to get to California where abortion was legal. It was 1972. I had followed my fiancé to graduate school in Houston. We now lived in a state where drivers legally chugged beers as they drove with loaded guns within arm's reach in their truck cab, where a white man called to a black man, "Hey boy," where a husband could kill his unfaithful wife and never go to jail. So we drove. We stayed in a cheap motel the night before, and a bus came at 2:30 a.m. the next morning. I boarded it, and it deposited me at a nondescript square, white and cold office building. It was dark and quiet as they ushered us inside. The women sat in plastic chairs, waiting. We said nothing as we studied the floor. I remember the cold and clinical doctors. They were protectively gowned in white, masked with only their eyes showing. They told me to count backward from 10. I got to 8. I woke up hearing someone repeating, "Is it over? Is it over?" It was me. The bus returned me to a cheap hotel, and I curled up on the bed. This was legal abortion near the California-Mexico border in 1972.
In 1978, I was 17 years old and living in a small, rural, conservative community. My then boyfriend and I had dreams of going to college, getting married, and then starting a family. That order was disrupted when we got pregnant. He did offer to marry me, but I knew that I wasn't ready. I also couldn't face the shame, stigma, and disappointment of my family and community. We looked in the phone book, found a clinic in a town 60 miles away, and made an appointment, which happened to fall between senior prom and student council elections. The boyfriend and I confided in no one, and luckily he had the money from a grocery store job to pay for the procedure. I remember in the week leading up to my appointment that I had an outer self that was going about my usual busy student routine, and an inner self that was terrified of being found out. At least then, I had access to safe and legal abortion, and I truly believe I would not be alive today if I hadn't. It was bad enough that my predicament at the time was considered shameful, but truly frightening that my resolution for it will once again be considered criminal.
As I reflect on our difficult journey to parenthood, I feel like it's important to recognize how privileged we are to have been ultimately able to create the family that we wanted in the way that we wanted. We know so many struggle in this regard, and hearing stories of birth after reproductive challenges can be painful to many. My reproductive journey started when I was 18, when I had an unplanned pregnancy and decided to have an abortion. This was the right decision for me, and it was also really hard. I vividly remember walking into the clinic alone and having to pass pro-life protesters at the entrance. I never told my parents, and my boyfriend at the time never told his parents. We felt deep sadness, shame, guilt, relief, more guilt about the relief, and along with all of that pain, there was also a deep knowing that it was the right decision for us. Although the intensity of the pain has greatly diminished, I still carry these complex emotions with me to this day. After this experience, access to birth control that I could be in control of became very important to me. I was a young part-time student without insurance, and thankfully someone told me about Planned Parenthood, which allowed me to buy birth control and pay on a sliding scale.
When my husband and I were done with our schooling, we were finally ready to start our own family, but we struggled to get pregnant. We went through extensive testing and even considered IVF, but eventually we were overjoyed to finally get pregnant on our own. Sadly, our joy was short-lived, and we miscarried early on in the pregnancy. Not long after that, we got pregnant a second time. This time we made it a little further, but that pregnancy also ended in miscarriage. When we got pregnant a third time, we were very nervous, but every appointment showed the baby growing on target, and she had a strong heartbeat, so we were hopeful that this would be a baby we would get to take home and start our family with. We named our baby after my late mother. Throughout the pregnancy, my husband tried to reassure me, but I was consumed with fear, and inside I knew something wasn't right. 20 weeks into the pregnancy, we had a routine, high-resolution ultrasound of the baby, and within the first few seconds, we could see that there was something very wrong. The ultrasound technician quickly got the doctor and confirmed that our baby had something very wrong with her brain. The next few days were a flurry of testing and appointments with expert neurologists, neurosurgeons, and geneticists. It was a torturous time. Even as we learned the devastating extent of our baby's neurological defects, I could feel her strong, kicking, and see her moving in my belly. In the end, we made the absolute heart-wrenching decision to terminate the pregnancy for medical reasons. The procedure was performed at 21 weeks of pregnancy. As heartbreaking as this was, we know that this was a compassionate decision, that we might not have had a choice to make had we lived in a different state. If Roe v. Wade is overturned, we fear that couples like us might not have the option to choose to do what they feel is right for their family. It has been a long and painful journey that reminds us how blessed we now are to have healthy children.
I invite you to take a breath. And join me in the spirit of prayer. Spirit of life and love, Spirit of this community gathered here who make this a safe and brave space. A space which allows each of us to bring our full selves, our strengths, our vulnerabilities, our successes, our struggles, our hopes and fears. We are thankful for all who shared their reproductive stories with us. We recognize the courage and vulnerability for many of us. And our sharing is a gift to bring the lived experience of this community into our responsible search for truth and meaning. We also know there are stories within our community that are unspoken, which remain in the sanctuary of our individual hearts. We hope these stories can be shared with someone trusted when appropriate. Our community's reproductive stories are important in their own right, and they're also important because they reflect the lived experience for many people today facing the same choices, the same struggles, the same uncertainty. People who face a struggle of starting a family, people who face uncertainty, guilt, shame, and suffering of unplanned and perhaps unwanted pregnancy. Their suffering is increased by the politicizing of a personal decision which limits the choices and risks the health and welfare of families. We are heartbroken for those vulnerable in our society who are denied the choice to do what is best for themselves. We are heartbroken that those facing an unwanted or unhealthy pregnancy are being stigmatized and intimidated by too many people in our society. As our hearts break, may they also open to strengthen our resolve to greater justice in our country. May we recommit ourselves to the cause of greater reproductive justice for all in our country, especially those who are most marginalized. May we recommit ourselves to the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy. May we recommit ourselves to the human right to have children, not have children, and parent children in a safe, sustainable community. Justice is what love looks like in public. Let our love fly beyond these walls to the many areas of the country where justice, and especially reproductive justice, is being thwarted. Let us be beacons of hope, care, and support for all who need it. Give us the strength and patience to continue the work of our ancestors who brought greater reproductive justice to us. And let us be willing to continue their legacy. Blessed be, and amen. I just want to share two very quick reproductive stories from my life. Natalie and I, like many honeymoon couples, we got pregnant in our honeymoon. The only problem was it was 3 months before our wedding. So, was there shame attached to that? No, we were in a relationship. We were going to get married, so we told our friends about it, and it was all a very exciting time. And, you know, our friends, most of whom didn't have children, were very excited for us. So we went to the first ultrasound about 8 or 9 weeks into the pregnancy, and there was no heartbeat. And it was an unplanned pregnancy, but it was certainly a wanted pregnancy, and we were devastated. And we went through the procedures, and I was talking to Natalie about this yesterday, and it was interesting in the terminology, because at the time we got the DNC, because there was no heartbeat. And Natalie said she's reframing that language yesterday. Says, that was an abortion that she had. Medically, it was a DNC, but it was an abortion she had. And we moved forward, disappointed. But our friends, many of the friends we shared it with, started coming forward with their own stories that they'd never told anyone. Natalie's best friend had 3 miscarriages, and it was never discussed. One of our close friends who was gay spoke to his mother about it. He's Irish, and his mother was back in Ireland. And mother talked about, for the first time, the number of miscarriages she had. And there's so much secrecy around miscarriages and reproductive justice and sexuality. It's so incredibly unhealthy. And we heard all these stories from people as a result of us being open. And we hear so often most people don't announce anything during the first trimester because miscarriages are relatively common. Later on, after we were married, we got pregnant again. And That was a different experience. The ultrasound was good. We were excited parents. We went through all the preparing for, the birth. And as Eisenhower says, plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Well, I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but Natalie laboured for 36 hours without an epidural. Then we eventually got the epidural, and then we had all these plans for it. I was going to give a speech as I cut the umbilical cord, and then the baby's heart rate dropped rapidly. We could hear it in the microphone. She got rushed into ER. We had an emergency C-section. And I was called in. They said, Father, get the scrubs on. So I was getting the scrubs on, and I came in. I had this wonderful speech I was going to make to Natalie when I cut the umbilical cord. She was there with 6 intendants. There was severe bleeding. And there was a sound of a crying baby over in the other corner. By the time I got there, with 2 nursing staff there. I went over and I looked at these 2 people I didn't know with masks and gowns and hats, and I was there. And I just looked, and this was Isla, who some of you have met. I looked at her, I looked at these strange medical staff. I said, thank you for doing the work you do. Welcome, I'm glad you're here. And I cut the umbilical cord. Not my greatest speech. And I went to Natalie to say the only thing I could think of saying. She was beautiful. But I recognized that we were disappointed in the C-section because we'd done all these plans. But then Natalie and I read that the life expectancy of women did not overtake men into successful C-sections and better birth processes in the medical establishment, because so many women died in childbirth. And then we found out that Natalie's father was born by C-section. So we realized her family might not exist, and our daughter might not exist, and Natalie might not be alive today if it wasn't for emergency C-sections. So we are so thankful that we had the privilege of good medical care, and we want that for everyone. That is what reproductive justice is, that people, everyone who needs it, has access to good medical care and reproductive care and prenatal care and postnatal care. That, for me, is what reproductive justice is. Having the choice to do that and having the means and accessibility to it.